Okay. So the Dark Ages came after the fall of Rome. The pillars of roads, infrastructures, aqueducts, government, just general organization. Those pillars came down. And the only pillar that was remaining was the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church unified and organized Western civilization from the time of the Roman Empire until the time of the Enlightenment. Out of the Dark Ages into the light, Westerners want to get there as fast as possible. As a Westerner, I will be blazing through the Dark Ages. So, this is not in any particular order, but the Vikings were also referred to as the Normans, the land of Normandy, the Northmen. They came to populate the north of France and what is now Scandinavia, like Finland, Sweden, and they developed some naval technology that would allow them to roll up in a boat and raid somebody. They were kind of the first colonizers, but they didn't really go somewhere and build. They would just show up somewhere, go berserk, fight fearsomely with axes and shields, because where the Romans and the Greek armies were tremendously organized, the Vikings kind of started to get things done with fury and craziness in the way that the barbarians that took over Rome would fight. A little bit more of the organization came from knights. These were fighting nobles, and there was a time, you see this a little bit in Game of Thrones, where the nobles will guard the ability to train in arms, train in fighting. Swords are, of course, expensive, but combat skills was something that you have to work to get. So, of course, you know the most famous of these medieval knights was King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Whether or not they existed is debatable. It's probable that it could be anybody. Sometimes the story is told all the way back as far as Rome, and sometimes King Arthur is repelling foreign invaders from England, but you can look that up. There's movies. This time around 300 to 500 AD, there was this Romano-British linguistic and cultural group building England, Romans and Celts. King Arthur was perhaps defending England from the Vikings and failing. The medieval times, or the Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages, some people wonder what was so dark about them. This is, of course, a Eurocentric title, Europe as the center. There were many other places in the world where awesome things were happening, but since this is Western civilization, it is the Dark Ages. Other places, of course, were doing great. The wars were less horrible because there was not a lot of organization with the armies. So when people would fight, it was fewer people fighting, fewer people dying. And since there was less organization, you couldn't get 1 million soldiers to roll through for months and months and months and kill people constantly. But unfortunately, there was no science to protect them from things like the Black Plague. The early Middle Ages, as opposed to the high Middle Ages, is 500 to 1066. Sometimes people will break it up and say that this was truly the Dark Ages. And after 1066, some things started to happen that made people a little bit more enlightened. This is a Renaissance fair. Americans like to do this, where people dress up in armor and have fake battles. It's pretty funny. People like the Dark Ages. I'm unfortunately not one of those people who's like really into it. One of the things that English people learn a lot about is William the Conqueror. He ended Celtic dominance in Great Britain, and he was kind of the founder of Anglo-England, which is the England that you see today. So it was kind of the beginning of their continuity as a country, because, you know, most countries, and a lot of these countries are quite old. Speaking of old, the Empire of Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Empire. Does that sound familiar? From 800 to 1806 was the middle of the of Europe, and it was unified by Christianity, and Catholicism in particular. Roman Catholicism has unified Europe and Europeans as Western civilization, as opposed to Orthodox Christians who were coming out of Constantinople, and now Russia is a good example of where that comes from, of that culture, the split between the Western and the Eastern Christian churches. Feudalism was a system of social order, something like another caste system, something like plebeians and patricians in the Roman system. In this situation, you have lords and vassals. The vassals are like the clients to the patricians. And then you have peasants, and peasants are like the plebeians. They're common people. The lords were like landlords of today. They would own things and not do too much, and the peasants would work the land, and they would pay tax to the lords who owned the land. Pretty good system for them. The vassals were maybe medium-level clients who would have people work their land, and then they would pay upwards to the lords. The way that this would work militarily is that if you have a small army, you were something like a liege lord. Again, you see this in Game of Thrones, where a smaller house will be sworn to defend a larger house. So if the larger house is going to war, they get all their vassals, all their clients, all their smaller people who are under them to go to war with them. 1066 saw a lot of innovation, and one of them was military. They started to return to this organization. The new military style was not about axes and berserk like the Vikings were doing. It was about a cleaner, more organized style of fighting, and with this organization came more bloodshed, of course. There were disciplined retreats and strategy. If you're a warrior, you don't want to be seen retreating, but sometimes retreating is the best idea. So around this time, militaries started to get their act together and realized that sometimes you do have to retreat in order to win the long war. The Crusades were times when the Catholic world remembered the Holy Land, and they wanted to go back and get their hands on it again, because it had fallen into the hands of the Islamic empires that were far better than anything Europe was doing at that moment, and Europe had a very hard time fighting against these Islamic empires. They did take Jerusalem back a few times, but the Islamic empires of this time were excellent in a lot of ways, and you should take a class or go into a YouTube hole and never come out. Find out what happened with the Islamic empires. So these are some of the routes the Crusaders would take. It was basically military campaigns that were spiritual and religious in nature, where people would be heading from Western Europe in a lot of ways, and they would a lot of times do terrible things along the way when they encountered people because they had to eat, and they would get into a lot of conflicts along the way. And then when they'd finally reach the Holy Land, they would, get in another war. I'm so excited about the Middle Ages, aren't I? The Crusades were trying to take back the Holy Land. It was controlled by Islam for centuries, but during that time, Christians could still make their pilgrimages. The Byzantines called upon the West to help them against the Turks. The Byzantines would be the Eastern Church at that time. Everybody got back to focusing on Jerusalem during this time. In the 1400s, see how quickly we got through this? In the 1400s, there was the Black Plague, which was something like a zombie apocalypse. It seriously killed half of Europe. Those left alive felt what? Like, what would you feel if you just survived something like that? There's an idea that this new mind of Westerners was kind of created by the Black Plague. It was something that left like a cultural trauma. Another thing is when we go back to study Guns, Germs, and Steel, you'll see that Westerners who survived the Black Plague were incredibly resistant to these forms of illnesses, these bugs, these sicknesses. And it was because partially we were immune to a lot of things because Westerners, Europeans, had a lot of farm animals and lived and did agriculture and farming. So there was a lot of bacteria around that Europeans were just rolling around in all the time. So there was a lot of resistance to bacteria because that's the way the immune system works, right? The Europeans that were left alive after the Black Plague were quite strong immunologically. So there were peasants' revolts in England, 1381. If it had succeeded, England would have become a Christian socialist nation. That's very interesting. After the Black Plague, the specialists were much younger. Priests were younger. A lot of times somebody would call for a priest and the priest wouldn't come because the priest was like, well, somebody's dying of the Black Plague. If I go give this guy his last rites and try to make him feel like he's on his way to heaven, what I'm going to do then is probably contract the Black Plague myself and die. So it started to loosen the grip that the church had on people because they stopped trusting priests because, a lot of people were dying. The Black Plague maybe created the modern mind. Were the nobles really willed by God to rule? This egalitarianism that Westerners are now so in love with, maybe it was born back then. Maybe this got us out of feudalism because we, of course, think feudalism is bad. How long were we going to live? You never know that. You could contract the Black Plague when you're 19 years old and then die very soon after that. People were increasingly cognizant of how precious and fragile life is. YOLO. You only live once. Got to look up the cartoon of the Theravada monk saying YOLO and everybody looking at him like, yo, you don't get it. So I already feel better. We're out of the Dark Ages into the Enlightenment, the Renaissance. It's called many things. The Enlightenment is kind of like a project. The Renaissance usually refers to kind of a resurgence of art and science to the point where art is done for art's sake, not just to glorify God. Science is done outside of the rules that the church was trying to impose. And the church was pretty serious about putting down bad ideas that they thought were contradictory to text. Nowadays, we have people that we call young earth creationists, and they believe that the earth is only a couple thousand years old because of what they have read in the Bible. And they think that dinosaur bones were put there by Satan in order to tempt us into believing that the world is much older and evolution is true. And most Westerners will laugh at that kind of thing. But and most Christians have a worldview that includes science. But the struggle between science and religion was a hard, long fight. And the Renaissance is seen as a really beautiful thing, but there's a lot of tough stuff going on. There's the Spanish Inquisition, for one, was the Catholic Church burning people who they called heretics, and they thought that they were not, they didn't have faith, or they were perhaps witches or something. And a lot of people got set on fire until they died. In the name of trying to cleanse the populace. So the church had a lot of power, and a lot of people think the church misused their power. There were astronomers that would look through their telescopes and they would see the movement of the stars and the planets, and they would realize, hey, the earth is round. The earth goes around the sun. The sun doesn't go around the earth. Look through my telescope. Look at these math problems. You can see that the earth doesn't go around the sun goes around the moon, the earth. No, the sun, heliocentric. That means the earth goes around the sun. These guys would say that, and then they would say, well, that's not what the church teaches. And there was a lot of people who said, you don't need any of this crazy knowledge out there. You just need the Bible. You need to listen to the priests, and you need to save your soul. That's all you need. Your life is really tiny. Don't try to go figuring out the secrets of the universe. And there are wise people who have said that, and it sounds like a better point coming from them. You might know who I'm talking about. But there's a point to which this is true, but I don't think they could have ever known how powerful science would become and how science now seems to have chased God back into some, they call him the God of the gaps, right? He is the God that only exists to answer the questions that you don't yet have an answer for. But every day we find out more answers where the answer used to be, oh, that's God is angry. That's why there's lightning. No, there's lightning because these clouds are cruising across the earth, creating static or electricity. So this tension between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and the power of the Catholic Church that had been safeguarding Western culture for so long is kind of like a child growing up and rebelling against its parents, plus lots of death. So a lot of people see it a lot of different ways, and most academics tend to look at this time as the church was wrong and the church really should be sorry for the way that it acted. And all these people that were pushing against it were right to do that. The society that has been built coming out of the Dark Ages using science is good. And we're happy that we've gotten out of there. And you can probably see that in me by the fact that I have talked for this one slide for 5 minutes. And that's probably about as long as I spent on the Dark Ages. Why did the Renaissance happen? Well, in Italy, they had money to support big art projects and scholars who read and taught 1,000-year-old texts, clothes, painters, food, all these things that these people needed. They didn't have Patreon pages back there. They had real patrons and very rich traders from places like Milan, Florence, Genoa. All these industrial city-states in the Italian area would get a hold of great artists, and then they'd put them up in their house. They'd have these big, beautiful houses, and they'd say, hey, I just want you to come live here, and you just paint for as long as you can. And that was how great artists lived. Some rich guy would say, come live in my house. Come hang out with my kids. I'd love to have Leonardo da Vinci in my house. That would be pretty cool. So a lot of people in Italy, in Renaissance Europe, would have these pet composers in their houses, and they were very happy to have them there. Here's some art emphasizing classical beauty, idealized human form. So here you have the thing that's so special about this is we're getting back to loving ourselves, loving humanity. Humanism is something that continues today that we are very much in love with. We think that equality of all human rights is a good thing. How about we get this out of your face? Ooh, that's nice. Equality of all human rights is something that we are very happy for having established, at least as a rule, that we all try our best to follow. And humanism was kind of born during this time. Look what I've done. There we go. Church of the Sistine Chapel, and this is God's communion with Adam, the first man. Michelangelo, one of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, if you don't know. He was one of the great Renaissance painters. Some people think that he drew a brain, and here you have the different elements of it. Leonardo da Vinci famously was in a lot of trouble for cutting up corpses all the time. So this theory here, which you can take or leave, is that they were trying to paint humanism into the religion. They were trying to defy God and say that man truly is, God is within us. We are divine. You see that kind of thing emerging in the art. The Mona Lisa is easily the most famous painting in the world. I don't have much to say about it because it just doesn't grab me. But I also don't like Justin Bieber, who is the most famous musician in the world. The Vitruvian Man is an icon. This is supposed to be the ideal portions of a human being. Leonardo was also a gifted physician. He also built flying machines. None of them would work. But the idea of a Renaissance man is somebody who kind of does everything, somebody who will be good at many skills. Medieval philosophy, a lot of it is Catholic because the people who were the most literate were monks. And before we had a printing press, monks would be the ones copying all of these texts. So a lot of what medieval philosophy was the rediscovery of Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. All these giants from the past were being unearthed, and we were remembering the past that we love so much. The recovery of ancient texts and the recovery of ancient culture, ancient ideals, such as democracy, which comes to envelop Europe again, replacing feudalism. This is a Renaissance painting of Socrates there on the left. I don't know who he's walking with. Probably some youth that he's corrupting. Copernicus was the scientist I spoke of before who was shown the instruments of torture. You stop talking about the sun being in the center, the earth being only the third planet away from the sun, or we're going to torture you to death and perhaps burn you at the end of all of that for saying something that now everybody knows. He was the first Gabot. Oh, technology. Heliocentric solar system. Heliocentric, the sun as the center, the sun as the middle. What did they used to think? Earth was in the middle. What do we know now? The sun is in the middle. I wish I had this slide before. Terra here is Latin for earth. Terraforming is a sci-fi word that means making an alien planet like Earth. Like breathing an atmosphere onto it. There's a nice little piece of vocabulary for you. So Copernicus, everybody refers to the Copernican turn. People use him as an adjective to try to talk about a time where you thought this was the center. No, actually the center is here. Everything that you thought about the whole nature of the universe was wrong, and really we're on a ball spinning through space and we are revolving around the sun. It just takes us out of the center. It makes us less special. And in addition to glorifying mankind, another thing that was happening during the Enlightenment was we were also realizing how small and insignificant we are. The birth of the way we are now, the Industrial Revolution, Gutenberg and the printing press, democracy, scientific materialism, multiple interpretations of things, which eventually leads to what they call postmodernism. There's a lot of talk about postmodernism these days. Don't get involved in it. It's like a bad habit. So the Industrial Revolution is obviously using a bunch of technology to change the way that we work and the way that the economy works. And we are in the middle of course, a technological revolution that people say is even more powerful than the Industrial Revolution. We talk a lot about how it affects music. The printing press was amazing because you didn't have to use monks to copy everything by hand anymore. So you could get more books out there because if you're a monk and you're like, hey, we don't have enough Bibles, and I can produce one every 3 days. So every week I'm going to produce 2.3333 Bibles. And if you have another book that's really great, it better be really great because I can only make 2 of these a week by hand. So the printing press became the internet of back in the day. All right, we're going to pause. Pause. A lot of people think that democracy emerged from the printing press because ideas that were not super central, like Catholicism or something else huge enough to be written by hand by monks, were able to be printed and then sent around. This is the beginning of something people call propaganda. You write your ideas down and send them around. Scientific materialism is not directly related to the printing press, but it's directly related to a lot of people learning a lot of things about science, and then scientific ideas being pervasive. Everybody starts to believe them, and then everybody starts to have a common worldview that revolves around science. A lot of these things come back to this invention. Multiple interpretations, apart from postmodernism, before we get there, is something where Protestantism rests on this, where you can have many different religious scholars who are reading the same text and seeing it different ways, and that's because they're all able to read it. Protestantism exploded because they translated the Bible into the native language of the people, which was German in Martin Luther's time. We'll get to them in a second. Here's the Reformation. You've got Protestantism versus Catholicism, Martin Luther, Anabaptists, and the Church of England. And of course, we're going to do not quite enough. So Protestantism, you see the word protest. Protest against what? They were protesting against Catholicism, which was the dominant force. Westerners like to protest against the dominant force. Catholicism then went through a counter-reformation, kind of cleaning itself up after what Protestantism said about them. You're doing this wrong. You're doing this wrong. No, we're not. No, we're not. And then we kind of said, oh, maybe we are. And they cleaned up a lot of things. Okay. So the first schism was between who? We talked about this a lot. Here's the West. Here's the East. Who's the West? Who's the East? The West is the Western Roman Empire and the Western Catholicism, the Roman Catholic Church, and then the Eastern Orthodox Church extending out of Constantinople. And Russia is the main the main country that inherited the tradition of Eastern Catholicism. So the second split, though, was between Catholics and Protestants. Why does the Pope, whose wealth today is greater than the wealth of the richest Crassus, one of the partners of Julius Caesar, known for being the wealthiest man in Rome, build the Basilica of St. Peter with money of poor believers rather than with his own money, said Hans Hildebrand. Martin Luther had problems similar to this, and his main problem with money and the church and corruption was that people were selling indulgences. And selling indulgences basically means you have heaven, you have hell, and you have somewhere in between that they call purgatory. And this is this is mainly a Catholic belief. Some other denominations believe it as well, but it means that you go to a place temporarily where your sins are burned off before you can enter heaven because you are spiritually not pure. And you need a little English intensive course before going into college. You need a little bit of getting ready. And that was believable to people because we are all taught that we are sinners, right? And you can't have your impure soul going to meet God and Jesus in heaven. You need to get cleaned off first. So purgatory was not a wonderful place where you take a bath. It was somewhere where demons torture you. So if somebody has recently died and you're imagining them somewhere where demons are torturing them, and the church is saying, well, you just come down and you pay this much money. It's a fixed amount of money. You pay this much money and we'll get grandma out of purgatory. Of course, if you want to be a good son, you'll do this for your mom. And of course, if you want to be a good anybody, you'll do this for anybody who's just died. A lot of people will do this for themselves and say, I want to go right to heaven, so give me a plenary indulgence. He had 95 problems. Jay-Z. So some of the things that Luther was doing were revolutionary, but in Munster, not the Munster Rebellion, but in Munster, they had a revolution that went even further. And that's what usually happens, is that you have power, and then you have a contest against the power, And then you have somebody says, how far can we go this? Let's push this even crazier. So there was a living prophet. There's Jan van Leyden and another Jan, and they had this kind of coup in which they took over a mostly Catholic town by slowly empowering the Protestant minority to become a majority. And they were all right with the Protestants, the Catholics were. But they were not all right with the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists thought that the project of baptizing infants was wrong because infants can't consent to baptism. Baptism is a sacrament where you dip the baby in the water and then they've received this sacrament, and it's then more likely that they can go to heaven. Some other sacraments are like communion. You put the wafer in your mouth. You also have the sacrament of marriage, which is one of the reasons that the church gets so upset about gay marriage, is because they think that they own marriage because it's one of the sacraments. Becoming a priest is a sacrament. So receiving the sacrament of baptism as an infant wasn't right to them because you're not really giving yourself to the religion when you're an infant because you're not consenting to do it. So they would, as adults, have their second baptism. And the Catholics hated this. And it was to the point where there were people in power who would kill Anabaptists by drowning them and say, there you go, you're having your third baptism. So Jan van Leyden was reportedly as handsome as Justin Bieber. But in the end, that didn't save him because the leaders of the Munster Rebellion, they took over the town, the Anabaptists, eventually over time. They had a prophecy about the end of the world, which Christians like to have prophecies about the end of the world. The book of Revelation is the place they usually turn to get their prophecies about the end of the world. The Jehovah's Witnesses had a prophecy about the end of the world. Many of them come. The world doesn't end, but they don't usually quit. So they thought the end of the world was coming, and they took over Munster, and they were put in monster cages afterwards. Not really. They were put in the Munster cages, which are still displayed from the top of the church. And if you go back, you can see these churches were central to the town. So after they put down the Munster Rebellion, they showed people, hey, look at these rotting corpses up here. Don't mess with the church. So the Church of England is another interesting Protestant faith. The Anabaptists, I brought them up because they're another Protestant faith. They took the idea of Protestantism like Lutheran had, Martin Luther and his followers had, and they went a little bit further with it. The Church of England was a different situation. Henry VIII couldn't get an annulment. He wanted to get divorced, and the Pope, why do you want to get a divorce? And well, making babies isn't going well. Well, maybe God's will is just not that you're going to shut up about that, So he didn't want to listen to the Pope. He wanted a divorce. The Pope wouldn't give it to him, so he says, I'm going to make a whole church. You're in charge of the church now, and will you give me a divorce? As a matter of fact, I will. Cool. The Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. They were some early American Europeans who had traveled to America, and they had gone there to have religious freedom, which sounds really beautiful, but they were such hardcore conservatives, it was crazy. If you read anything about the Pilgrims, you'll see very quickly that they had towns where people were watching each other and spying on each other, and everybody was very repressed. It was the Victorian England ideals, but made even stronger with their own brand of Christianity. Protestant Christianity. Calvinism is another one of the strong brands that was over coming across the ocean into the United States, because different groups, Christian groups, they felt very strongly about how to practice their particular brand of Christianity, and if it wasn't going well in England, they would move to the United States. There's a movie called The Witch that was put out by the Church of Satan, and that was really interesting, and it takes place in early English colonies in the United States. It's another movie that I do not recommend that you watch, because all of the movies that I've seen that left impressions on me have done so because they are horrifying. The Witch. Imperialism. So the 1400s through the 1700s is often known as the Age of Discovery, where Europeans were discovering places that already had people in them. Europe was looking for a faster way to trade with the East because there was awesome stuff over here and they wanted it. Expeditions led to new lands because they were wandering around looking for the East and they would mess up and find somewhere new and cool. The contact with these places led to new wealth because they would usually set up a way of extracting that wealth from the people. The countries colonized these new places. Competition demanded that they continued. So England felt like the rest of the European powers were grabbing up a bunch of colonies, and they're like, well, these are my rivals, my enemies right next door to me. You look at somewhere like China. People ask often, why didn't China conquer the world? Well, it's partially because China has a unified culture. They have a unified linguistic group now. And Europe didn't have a unified culture. Europe had many different cultures that were striving against each other often. So when the Age of Discovery rolled around, you really can't afford to let France or Germany beat you because they may be conquering your territory next week. So everybody felt very pressured to continue running around, finding people with less technology, without a ton of military organization, without guns, without germs, without steel. Without germs is because they don't live with, they didn't do a ton of agriculture. Agriculture is something that Europeans did a ton of. And a lot of these places they were finding had nomads. And nomads would cruise around and they would live a life that was amazing, actually. If you look at their quality of life, they eat different foods every day, just like you do. And we have only recently gotten up to a level where our life is as good as the life of hunter-gatherers. Agriculture was a long, slow, hard thing for everybody but us. We benefit greatly from their sacrifice. What made these crazy people go on these expeditions across barren seas where you get scurvy and you're probably going to die? Maybe a storm's going to kill you when you show up on one of these shores. Maybe you're going to get hit by a spear and that's the end of you. What made them go? Travel, adventure, the romantic idea of the high seas. But really, their lives were horrible enough to risk. And a lot of Westerners that you see over here are over here not because they are travelers or they want adventure or they like the romance of being a traveler. Some people's lives are really horrible and they are running away and they are hiding here. So beware of Westerners. Here's some of the routes Westerners took to go out and kill people and take slaves. Magellan, famous for what? Circumnavigating the world. He was the first to go around the world. Matter of fact, he died in the Philippines, and he did not make it all the way around the world. He was killed in the Philippines. The Queen put up a monument. The Filipinos put up a monument too, but they put up a monument for Lapu-Lapu, who was the man who killed him. It is 60 meters tall. Here's Magellan. There's the guy that killed him. And that thing is huge. It's like, I believe it's bigger than the Buddha in Budamonton, and it's for the assassin of Magellan. I recently spoke with a Filipino guy who told me that Filipinos are cool with Magellan now because they thought that he was out trying to spread Christianity, and many Filipinos are Christian. Spain is where he started out from, and Filipinos speak English in a way that sounds very Spanish to my ear. When I hear them talk, it reminds me of the Mexicans I knew in the west of the United States. It's a really similar sound to their English. Okay, Hernán Cortés defeated the Aztecs with horses, guns, swords, and germs. This is what I've been talking about. When Cortés and his men showed up, they were not immediately militarized. They weren't immediately, they were walking around wearing swords, they had guns, they had their horses, and they were excellent on their horses. It's like Deck Wan on a motorcycle, just that had excellent control over these beasts. And there were not horses in North America before then. So these people had never seen these giants. What are they, like 3 meters tall walking around with these giant boomsticks. You point at my friend and all of a sudden he magically dies. This is insane. They have these big long swords. The swords were great technology, and the guns were not so accurate and amazing, but if you can just set off a bam explosion and then the guy next to you dies, it's going to start to make you think that these are aliens or perhaps gods. There happened to be an Aztec prophecy that was going to say that people like this were going to come and they were going to end your civilization. But it wasn't just in fights, it was handshakes that was killing them, because the Europeans, like I said, lived with farm animals for many years and developed a lot of, there was just a dirty, germy environment around them all the time that they didn't know about because they didn't have a germ theory of disease yet. And these germs were so strong, and the Europeans had an immunity to them, that when they went and met these people who live clean, they're always camping, moving from place to place, they ended up smallpox, measles, influenza. The Black Plague killed half of Europe. The conquistadors, which is what they called these people, it means conqueror. They were the ones who did not die from the Black Plague. And these guys were crazy, and just by shaking hands with the native people, with the Aztecs, they were able to kill so many of them all the way to Mexico City, which was called Tenochtitlan. And it's on this beautiful lake. It's a cool city. This is his route into Mexico. There's United States up there, South America down there. Francisco Pizarro killed the last Incan emperor. The Incas were around here, around Chichen Itza in Peru. And that's a really beautiful place if you can ever go there. I was asking, why did the Chinese not take over the world? At this point, they had giant ships, fleets of 25,000 sailors, and some of the ships had no people on it. They only had dirt, and they were there to grow oranges because you could get scurvy, which is a horrible disease if you don't have enough vitamin C. And at sea, when you're only eating fish, you don't get enough orange. So people died from that. The Chinese were on point with it, though. They would have a boat that's just basically a farm. So it's kind of just a twist of luck that the Chinese did not do the Age of Discovery, go around and conquer the world, and the whole world is probably Chinese in another version of this great game that we're playing. More so. So the consequences were that Europe became rich and arrogant. The world became increasingly connected from this point on, up until now, where we are ridiculously connected. Pretty soon, perhaps, we'll be one mind experiencing itself subjectively. Politics and the liberal arts, it's very interesting to see the way that Westerners view colonialism, because you used to have this idea of the bold conquistador out there bringing Christianity, technology, and order to the land of the savages. And, you know, they have these cute dogs climbing up on the horse. But from the 1960s on, they were portrayed negatively. These conquistadors were seen as bad people. And the movement that started up is called post-colonialism. And part of this is because as early as World War I, these industrialized nations were saying, hey, we can't be doing this. This is obviously wrong. We're going and enslaving these other places and stripping them of their resources. The United States led the way with this because the United States kind of realized, hey, we kind of have everything that we need in our own country, including lots of space. So let's start saying that everybody else who has to go get resources from other people by using force, let's say that they're bad because we don't have to do it. So all these other people in the world started to become the subject of history. There's a guy named Howard Zinn. Maybe I have a slide of it. And he wrote a book called A People's History of the United States. I believe he also has A People's History of the World. So these new scholars started to show up and say, hey, this guy is not so good. We want to tell the story from the point of view of the people who were sitting on the beach one day and all of a sudden a ship came out of nowhere. And these guys got off the ship, and then everyone they ever knew and loved died. And they saw themselves become a slave race out of nowhere just because a ship showed up. It would be as if we're sitting here living our life the way that we've always lived our lives, and then all of a sudden alien saucers show up in the sky, and these crazy creatures land, and then they kill all of us and suck our planet up into a big straw because we are just a single bubble in the bubble tea of some giant alien that likes to drink bubble tea, and we're just a bubble. That's all Earth is. That's what post-colonialism means. And there was a ton of racist cartoons that were going around, and this looks like it's pretend, but I think this was actually a real thing that they're trying to show. Here's the English and the Americans trying to drag the less developed races of the world up this hill out of ignorance and superstition and vice and barbarism and oppression. We want to drag them up to, what does this say? Oh, just good things, probably. That looks like it says slavery. But at the top of it is civilization. Western civilization will bring these people up to the level of Western civilization. One way that you can still see this is in the insistence that all countries be democratic. And you get this a lot in Thailand, Westerners are very critical of anything that is not democracy. It's for a lot of reasons. One bad reason is, like, in World War I, when the Americans wanted to fight the Germans, they were fighting against the Kaiser, who was the Caesar, who was the unquestionable lord of the place. But they couldn't really say that they were fighting against the German people in a total war, because the German people were being ruled by these rulers. They were not chosen. So a lot of times people think, if you have democratically elected your leader, and then your leader does something that we don't like, and then we want to kill all of you, at least we're killing all of you and you have decided politically together. That's the bad version of it. The good version of it is that people who love democracy think that somebody is not really able to take their country to war as easily without justification, because everybody has chosen you and you are the voice of the people. So if the people don't want war, and the people often don't want war, it's not easy for normal people to fight a war, then the rulers can't really make it happen as easily. So you can look this kind of stuff up. I put on the internet, hey, send me racist cartoons, please. So here's another one. The white man's burden, trying to clean everybody up. It's ridiculous. So technology, democracy, and capitalism are the things that we were trying to bring to all of the world. In the Cold War, you see that capitalism was the thing that the West is trying to give to everybody. Christianity was among them. There's a lot of jokes about missionaries and saying, hey, maybe these people need food before they need your Bible. So maybe you should start with feeding people before you start trying to feed people your religion. But that's something you can see from a lot of different angles, because there's not a lot of people out there just giving Bibles. If they're in the town, they're also feeding people. The argument back is they're only becoming Christian because you're feeding them. Then some missionaries say, hey, whatever, by any means necessary. I know you don't believe, but I believe. I'm trying to save people's souls. Up to you. Exploitation. It is not very much in question that Europe used the resources and the peoples of other nations in a way that is not a good two-sided relationship. And Western Europe is trying to clean that kind of stuff up, but there's a lot of guilt left over in people about the way that Western wealth has been accumulated. Here's one of them. Slave trade, American slavery is particularly bad, but you can see that in Brazil has a huge black population, and almost all of them are over there because of the slave trade. And this is American slavery. It's not the whole nation. This is where American slavery took place. These were slave states. Up here were free states. Like New York was a free state. You did have slavery in Europe, not to the degree that you had it over here, because in the United States, slaves were farm equipment, and they were treated like farm equipment. People could do whatever they want, including kill the slaves. And they had slavery in ancient Europe for a long time. But the difference in degree, because slavery has existed throughout all of time, the difference in the degree is often discussed like in a discussion between people. What the Europeans were doing in going down to Africa and empowering people as their mercenaries to go out and find people they didn't like and sell them into slavery, take them across the ocean like this for days and days and days and days and days. And many would die. 30%, 40% would die. I wanted to show you a video from the series American Gods, in which the god Anansi goes downstairs into the slave ship, unchains a guy, and tells him what slavery is going to be. And he says that it's 300 years of torture. Your kids are going to be slaves. When you're finally not slaves anymore, the American police first you're going to deal with Jim Crow laws, which means you have to go to different schools, you can't go to the same bathroom, you can't swim in the same pool, and that's going to last up until time that people that you know and have met have dealt with this. People you know and have met have had to hide in the backs of cars and wait, for the white people to go by before they can stick their head up, because they're driving in a car with a white person, and you can't be doing that in a town in the United States. Racism in the United States was very recently very horrible, and there's a lot of guilt still remaining in Western culture because of that. Uncle Tom's Cabin this is what this picture is from, is a book that will detail a lot of the evils of slavery. And then Uncle Tom was a slave that what that means now is it's a slave who works for the white people to hurt their own people. So the United States began in 1776, and a lot of people think that American slavery ended quite late. We needed to fight a huge war, which was the bloodiest war ever fought on American soil. 1861 to 1865 was the American Civil War, North versus the South. Abraham Lincoln presided over it. Discrimination continued as Jim Crow laws, which meant you can't go to the same movie theater, bathroom, restaurant, public pool, definitely and notoriously schools, and there was a Supreme Court case that fixed that. South African apartheid lasted until the 80s, 90s. That was happening in my lifetime. So here's a political map. These were the northern states. These were the southern states. The Civil War was between the farmland, the breadbasket of America at the time. This is most of the farmland now. There's a lot of farmland in California as well. But these were the northern free states versus the southern slave states. The Confederacy is the southern states, and the northern states were called the Union. So the United States was split when the South seceded, which means quit America. Half of America quit. You can look this kind of stuff up. Slavery did happen in many other places. Brazil is a good example, a bad example of it. And the next video will be about the nation state. So in the transition to the nation state, one of the things to think about is the U.S. is particularly culpable because of its subsequent success. If you think about the belief of the idea of a nation, the belief in the idea of a nation, you got to wonder if a nation can be guilty. That's one thing that a lot of people wonder. The United States benefited greatly from slavery. The economy of using people's labor for free against their will for many, many, many years has benefited some people greatly, and it benefited the country greatly, and those benefits were not split equally among the people who lived there. A lot of people think the United States is not very good at apologizing for things like dropping nuclear bombs on people and doing slavery. A nation such as Germany, however, is pretty much famous for being good at apologizing. The Holocaust, as we will see, where 6 million Jews, Gypsies, Roma people, disabled people, and political enemies of the Nazi cause were exterminated systematically and horrifically, is the worst event in all of history, according to most Westerners. And the Germans are thought to be a people who have successfully apologized for the Holocaust. And they've kind of done so in saying, we will never have apologized enough for the Holocaust. We will be apologizing for this forever, and we're okay with that. So that's kind of the path that they went, and the Americans, not so good at that sort of a thing. But Germans are very good at everything. If they want to kill you, they're good at killing you. If they want to go to war against you, they're good at going to war against you. If they build microphones, the microphones are really amazing. And if they want to say, I'm sorry, they're very good at saying, I'm sorry. Can a nation be guilty? Can a nation be talented? Can a nation be this, that, and the other thing? We're going to talk about different forms of government and different forms of what a state is: city-state, nation-state, empire, things like that. Have fun writing your test.